Welcome to the Travel Gluten-free Podcast, where you can listen in on how to lead a gluten-free lifestyle with more fun and ease. Travel gluten-free is like having a best friend by your side to give you the most up-to-date gluten-free traveler information. Let Travel Gluten-free be your #1 source for tips, tricks, and advice you can use to safely navigate your next gluten-free travel adventure. Enjoy food, enjoy travel, and enjoy life. And now, here's your show host, Elikqitie.
Hey, my gluten-free friends, this is Elikqitie, and I'm so excited for this podcast episode today because we're doing a little bit of a turnaround. So I have one of my podcast friends. His name is Marvin, and he is going to be interviewing me on my podcast. Hi, Marvin. Welcome to the Travel Gluten-free Podcast.
Well, hello, Elikqitie. Thank you for having me. And for my listeners, this is Uncle Marv with another episode of Uncle Marv's Reunion Podcast, where I interview friends, family, and almost famous people.
I like the almost famous. I definitely think I fit into sort of that category. Before we jump into the episode, though, I do want to remind you to make sure you come over to YouTube and subscribe to see all of the video episodes of Travel Gluten-free that I'm going to be posting this upcoming fall and all of the new product reviews I will be putting on there as well. All right, so I'm going to let Marv take it over from here. We're going to have Marvin. He's going to be, and I have no idea what he's going to, well, I have sort of an idea what he's going to ask me, but I don't know the specific questions. So Marv is going to fire away, and then he's going to ask me my travel and gluten-free questions at the end. All right, Marvin, it's all you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that have listened to my podcast, you know that I just find people from my past that I've interviewed and had on here. This is a little different. I met Elikqitie. Well, I actually met her through the internet a while ago, but finally met her in person at a recent PodFest conference in Orlando. And we hooked up and said, okay, now we got to do something. So here we are. Now, let me first ask you, Elikqitie, first of all, do you make everybody call you Elikqitie, or do you ever tell anybody your real name?
So everybody in the podcasting industry knows me by Elikqitie. So at creator conferences, podcast conferences, I go by Elikqitie. So I do go by my given name, but I only go by that like when in my professional setting, kids call me my given name. But I go by Elikqitie anytime I'm in a creative setting or I'm doing podcasting things.
Okay. And is that kind of related to, I don't understand the meaning of Elikqitie. My nickname is pretty easy.
Uncle Marv.
Yours, there's a little bit of work that has to be done to understand what it means.
And I get this question a lot. And this is actually the first time I've talked about this on my podcast. Several years ago, when I was going through a divorce, I hired a life coach because I was, like, what am I going to do now? Blah, blah, blah. So I put my email on there, which my handle for my email was Elikqitie. And my life coach said, wait, how do you say that? And I'm like, Elikqitie. And he's like, girl, this is the coolest name ever. If you don't market that in some way he also added some swear words in there. I'm not going to say right now. He's like, if you don't market this in some way, he's like, I'm going to be highly disappointed in you, which is the clean way of what he said. So anyway, when I started my podcast, I'm like, I might as well market my name Elikqitie and use it as a podcast branded name. And so I started using it, and everybody loves it. And when I go to podcast conferences, people immediately recognize me because no one else has my name.
Okay. So I came across your podcast a while back because I have been on this off again, on again search for ways that I could be more healthy. Now, a lot of times it's based on just eating healthy. I've been involved with sports all my life, so I've pretty much been in shape. When people look at me, oh, you're not so bad. I'm not obese or anything like that. I am older, and I did retire from sports a few years ago and just kind of let myself go. So I'm going to be starting a podcast coming up soon, and it's all about living healthy and being happy. And I came across your podcast, and it intrigued me for a number of reasons. The first is I am one of those kind of noobs that never understood what eating gluten-free was. So I thought, okay, here's somebody who's doing a podcast about traveling gluten-free. So let me listen. And so I've gotten some tips and stuff on that. So before we dive too far into stuff, let me ask you to explain to novices like me, what is the real meaning of gluten-free?
So gluten It means the protein that is a protein. And it is a protein like casein is a protein that's found in dairy. Gluten is a protein that's found in wheat, barley, rye, triticale, and a couple other grains. And so that's what gluten is. It's just a protein. And that's why there's several different things you can't eat when you are gluten-free, because that protein is not just in wheat, it's also in other grains. So you can't eat any grains that have gluten in it. And so eating gluten-free means you're eating only foods that do not contain the gluten protein.
Now, when I first heard of this, I always had the impression that it was one of those high society, fruity type diets, because the people that were claiming to eat gluten-free at the time didn't really have a reason except that, oh, it's healthy. Now, I believe that, and it was only recently that I actually realized that there's a disease attached to this called celiac. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yes.
Okay. And I've heard you on your podcast say that that's what you have.
So the story behind gluten-free is that there are certain people that do it for medical reasons, like myself. Like if I eat gluten, like last night, actually, I had a pizza and they made it gluten-free and everything, but it still got cross-contaminated. And like literally right after I ate it, I started getting really badly bloated. Like my joints hurt today. I'm going to be sick for the next 3 days. Like I can't eat that much. For people that do it for medical reasons, for what I call real reasons, it is definitely healthy. It was a fad thing for a while that people were just trying it out. And that actually hurts a lot of the people who are eating for medical reasons. And I'll tell you the reason why. And it's because I went to a restaurant for my birthday one time and I explained to them, like, I can't eat gluten. It's for medical reasons. So like, I can't have croutons on the salad. I can't do all this, blah, blah, blah. So he's like, no problem. We can accommodate you. So they brought me the salad and it had croutons on it. And I told him, I said, well, you'll need to take this back and remake it. You can't just take the croutons off, because if the crumbs are on there, I'll get really sick. And he's like, oh, I'm glad you told me that, because a lot of people come in here, they say they're gluten-free, like air quotes, gluten-free. And I bring them a salad with croutons and they're like, oh, it's not a big deal. I can eat it. And so those are the people who are messing it up for the rest of us who need to do it, because we will get insanely sick if we eat gluten. And I'm not talking about like a stomach ache. I'm talking about like a cross between the food poisoning and flu. Like it's really bad. And you get it for many days. And everybody's a little bit different. Some people get migraines, headaches. Like I get really bad joint pain, muscle pain, vomiting, the other end, like all that crazy stuff I'm not going to go to TMI with, but you can kind of get the drift.
All right. And also from your podcast, you're going to see, I actually listened. You haven't had this your entire life. This is something that you found out you had later in life. So what was the adjustment period like when you found out and had to change the way that you lived for all the...
Well, at first, so I was 42 when I found out. I just had my 50th birthday. When I first found out, actually, it's funny, my daughter and I found out at the same time. When I first found out, the first thing I thought of is like, oh my God, like I have an Italian background and I grew up eating pasta and bread. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. There's nothing to eat. Like that's pretty much what everybody thinks of, because the first thing you think of is pasta and bread. No one ever gets diagnosed with celiac disease. And they're like, I'm so glad I can still eat asparagus and broccoli. Like no one ever does that, right? So you're always thinking about cake, like all the good stuff, pastries that you want to eat that you think you can never eat again. And then after some time, I started looking up, like you go in the supermarket, looking up brands, and then figuring out like all of the different flours I can make things with. And I loved to bake before I had celiac disease. And so now the challenge was, how do I make all of my grandmother's baking recipes with gluten-free, right? And I learned that there's like 12 or 14 different gluten-free flours I can use. It's crazy. There's like rice, brown rice, white rice, sweet rice flour, almond, coconut, teff, sorghum, quinoa flour. The list goes on. And they all have different flavors, which is really great. The only downside is because they don't have gluten in them, that loses the stickiness. So you have to use guar gum or something else to stick them together. But I eventually learned over time that I can make a lot of the stuff that I normally eat gluten-free. It's just you have to figure out how to do it with what flour. And now there's lots of 1-to-1 flours out there, which means you can use like traditional quote unquote recipe says, use a cup of wheat flour. You can use a cup of 1-to-1 flour, but you can't directly use, like I can't just use a cup of almond flour as a substitute for a cup of wheat flour, because it's different texture. It holds water differently. It's a whole different thing. So I learned how to make food differently. I learned how to travel. I learned like what to pack, when to pack, what not to pack, just from experience, because I did love traveling before I had celiac disease. So I just had to like basically relearn how to do my lifestyle, but do it gluten-free.
Okay. So there's a lot of stuff in there that I did not understand. So I'll have to ask you at a later date to explain some of it. But the one thing I want to ask is you talked about things not sticking together. So are you talking about in the baking process, like if somebody's making brownies, like the brownies won't stay together if you use non-gluten stuff?
Gluten is what makes regular bread and stuff like fluffy stick and basically it makes it really sticky. And so as soon as you put water on flour, the gluten activates and it's basically like glue.
Okay.
And so that's another reason why they use wheat in a lot of different glues. And so one of the things I have to be very careful of is not to use paper straws because the glue they use in paper straws usually has some liquid gluten in it to make it stick together. So there's like certain really weird things you have to watch out for when you have celiac disease like that.
My. Okay. So that's quite interesting. So these are things that, once I finally started being open to listening, because a lot of times, like I told you, some of the people they weren't really gluten-free people. They would just,
Trying it out,
kind of like, I have Jewish friends that are truly kosher and then I have some that are not. So trying to understand, okay, why and why not is a big thing for people like me. So thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
Now, before we go on, do you have a question for me based on what I've asked you as to why would you ask those types of questions?
Glad you're asking these questions because what people generally don't understand who don't have celiac disease, and I didn't understand before I had celiac disease, is that one of the things is like celiac disease and allergies are technically different. So like an allergic reaction would be like anaphylactic shock or hives. And although some people who have celiac disease do get hives, it's not considered a quote unquote allergy. But when you go out to restaurants, a lot of people don't understand what celiac disease is, but they understand gluten allergy. So you have to use terminology that people understand. And so that's one of the big challenges that, like, if you go into a restaurant and you say, I have celiac disease, they're like, oh yeah, I totally understand. That's gold. That's gold when you have celiac, because it really does put you down for like it's an autoimmune disease, which means that when you eat gluten, your body attacks itself, and the part of your body it mainly attacks is your small intestine, and it does a lot of damage to your body. And the only solution is to eat a gluten-free diet. Like there's no real medicine and there's no cure for it. Like once you turn on the gene, it never turns back off. You just have to regulate it with diet and healthy lifestyle. There's lots of caveats to having an autoimmune disease, and autoimmune diseases look different in different people. With autoimmune disease and like everything else in life, diet is so essential. Like I can't like I used to hear people say that all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, whatever, diet. I'm like, no, diet is so essential to your health, especially when you have an autoimmune disease or you're dealing with a health condition.
So going back to when you got diagnosed, were there certain things that led you to say, I need to get checked out? I mean, was there an event, or was it something over a period of time where you're like, something's not right? How did that happen?
Yeah, I actually found out by accident because I had been having stomach issues for a long time, for probably 2 or 3 years. I knew I had adrenal fatigue, which is when you get really stressed out and your adrenals just kind of go kaput, and then you're tired all the time and there's all these different symptoms. So I went on what's called the adrenal fatigue diet. And so when I did that, I took gluten and dairy and some other stuff out of my diet, and my stomach felt better. Like I noticed I wasn't drinking ginger tea every day because I was drinking that every day because my stomach was always sick. I didn't feel tired. Like my brain fog went away. Like there was a lot of things that resolved. And so when I put every time I put gluten back in my diet, I was horribly sick for days. I ended up getting tested. And so what the doctor didn't do the test correctly, but it still showed up for gluten. So I still tested positive for gluten, even though they didn't do the test correctly. And I didn't go in for the biopsy because once I got that test back, they didn't tell me to keep eating gluten to like go to do the biopsy. So I got off of gluten, and nobody told me to do the biopsy because I have all of the symptoms, like all of my other labs come back showing that I have an autoimmune disease. So I definitely, and my younger daughter, who is 22 now, she has celiac disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and she just got diagnosed with lupus. Because once you have one autoimmune disease, it's really easy to get a second one. So she has 3 autoimmune diseases. So she has a lot more to deal with than I did. And I did not have it at her age. I was in my 40s when I had it. So she definitely has more challenges than me. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. And a lot of doctors don't want to it's just a simple blood test for celiac disease. A lot of doctors don't want to do it for some reason. I don't know why. It's really strange. If your doctor won't give you a blood test and you feel like it might be celiac disease, go to a different doctor, because there's a doctor out there that's going to help you. You just have to find them.
So in terms of, how you contract this, it sounds like you and your daughter, obviously in the same gene pool, you say it's a gene that gets turned on. So is this kind of a genetic thing that can be passed down? Is it like family traits that you can detect this? Or
So it is actually, I think 2 or 3 genes that completely go into it, but there's one gene that is specifically for celiac disease. And then, so what happens is that you can go through your whole life with the gene and never have it, but something environmentally has to turn it on. And for me and a few other people that have celiac disease, I noticed that we all got it when we went through our divorce. So stress is definitely a trigger. Like us and our children got it at the same time. And so that stress was probably, I mean, I don't have any data to prove this except for my own experience and people I talk to, but I find that really common, that like big stressful events turn on that gene. And then once you turn it on, you can't turn it off. That's the thing. So once it does come on, and it can come on at any time in your life. Like I've met people who were 66 when they got diagnosed. So just because you are older doesn't mean you can't get it. And you can get it at any age, starting at like birth till like you're 80. Like it does not matter. You can get it at any age because you have to have the gene and it has to be turned on. Now, my older daughter, who's 26, she does not have celiac disease, but I told her if she ever has digestive issues on a regular basis, she needs to get tested, because if you have it, you definitely want to find out, because if you keep eating gluten and you have celiac disease, you can get some really gnarly cancers, including the one my dad passed away from. 99% sure he had it, but they didn't test him for it. And then my grandmother, my dad's mother, also had an autoimmune disease called polymyositis, which is an autoimmune disease that attacks your muscles primarily and joints. And she got that right after my grandfather and my great grandmother passed away in the same year. So her mother and her husband passed away in the same year, and she got that 6 months later. Wow. So stress is definitely a trigger for autoimmune disease.
Well, wow. Sounds like a lot to digest and learn. And so here we are 8 years later, you're doing this podcast and educating people on this. Now, what made you start the podcast?
That's a great question. So podcast, I don't know if I ever talked about this on my podcast, but the reason I started my podcast was because I was traveling on the Pacific Coast Highway, like day 5 or 6. I was by myself. It was a 3-week road trip. I just found out that like I couldn't eat gluten, and I was sitting at a gas station and I realized, like, if I get gluten and I'm by myself for 3 weeks, like how am I going to take care of myself? Because I get like in bed sick from it. Right. And so I was like, okay, somebody out there has to have some information on how to travel gluten-free, like road trips, how to cruise, like what to pack, all that good stuff. So when I went back from my trip, I was looking online and I didn't see anybody who had really good comprehensive, like how to travel gluten-free. So I was talking to one of my friends who podcasts. I don't know if you know Chris Nessie. He's really big in like the education podcasting scene. We were having margaritas on South Street because I was speaking at a international teachers conference at the time in Philadelphia. And I said, well, Chris, I had this idea. I gave him the background for it. I said, it's called Travel Gluten-free, and I'm going to do a blog and then do a podcast. And he's like, well, why don't you do a podcast first? And I said, well, why would I choose to do a podcast first? He said, because there's 4 million blogs and 250,000 podcasts. I'm like, that is a good point, and I'm going to do a podcast first. So I do have a blog, but I started my podcast first, and I really, really, really like Chris turned me on to podcasting. And this is a big shout out to Chris Nessie, because podcasting has actually become a part of my career and my lifestyle and everything. So it's been so much fun, and I love podcasting.
Wow. Great story. Great story. So I'm assuming that you have a cult following now of people that are so thankful to you for putting this out. So do you have any great stories of listeners that have contacted you and said, thank you so much, you saved my life, or whatever? I mean, I'm sure you have a ton of them, right?
So yeah, a couple of them that kind of stick out to me is one is I had somebody contact me through Instagram, and she said she's gluten intolerant. She tells her husband she can't eat gluten, that she has to pack food for her trip, but she doesn't know what to pack. And her husband's like, no, you don't need to pack food. She's like, can you do an episode for me on what snacks you like to, take when you travel, so I can travel and bring food with me I know is safe. So I did that episode for her. But like my favorite story is I was at a gluten-free conference in Salt Lake City. A couple came up to me who I had met at that same conference like 3-4 years ago. And they said, like, when they had first met me, she had just got diagnosed with celiac disease, and she didn't know what to do and everything. And she started listening to my podcast, and they were really scared to travel. And they said after listening to my podcast for 3 years, they finally got the energy together to go and travel because they listened to my podcast and I helped them travel. And like, that's the icing on the cake for me, because it is about being gluten-free and it is about traveling. But really what my whole platform is about is leading your own lifestyle the way you want to, regardless regardless of your autoimmune disease. Like, don't let your autoimmune disease stop you from traveling or doing whatever you enjoy in life. Find a way around it. Like, you can do it. It just takes more preparation, more planning, and more scheduling, but it's totally possible.
Very interesting that that couple would say that to you. For people like me who, try to follow a particular diet or particular regimen, we always have the mindset that when we go on vacation or when we travel, whatever we were doing at home is out the window. It's no big deal. For instance, I was just at a family reunion and I ate like I wasn't worried about stuff. And you don't have that option. So I have to believe that there are thousands, if not more people who, like you, want to be able to travel, want to be able to be out there and live the lifestyle, as you say. What is the biggest thing you've learned about figuring out this travel-free journey?
The biggest thing I think for traveling gluten-free is just like knowing where you're going, what you're doing, and really preparing ahead of time for it. Like, if you prepare and you know, like, hey, I'm going to have to bring food, or like if I'm going on a cruise this weekend, so I'm only bringing snacks for the airplane because I know I'm going to get food on the cruise that I can eat. So like just knowing like what your limits are. Like, if you get really tired from your autoimmune disease, don't plan something that you know you're going to be exhausted, because then it's just not enjoyable. And like my friend Jen Hardy of the Hardy Mom podcast says, is it's okay to stay at your hotel and say, hey, I need a day off. You guys go and have fun. Like, I'm perfectly okay with that, because sometimes with autoimmune disease, you're just too tired or too whatever, and you can't go out. Or like if you get gluten and you don't feel good and you just want to stay at the hotel, like that's okay. Like, it's okay. And you need to really be an advocate for yourself.
I keep trying to ask this in a very nice way, but is it really...
Just spit it out there. Just throw it out there, Marvin. We're good.
I mean, how hard is it really to travel and eat gluten-free, besides the restaurants that you say that a lot of times the waiters and waitresses don't even know what that means? I have to imagine that when you talk about bread and pasta and wheat, I mean, that's a big part of the American diet. So
yes.
How much of that gets taken away that you have to adjust for?
A lot of it, I eat gluten-free pasta, gluten-free bread. Like I found all those things gluten-free from different companies, and I have my favorites because I've been gluten-free for 8 years. So I know what I can and can't eat. And the other thing that I discovered last year is that I have SIBO, which basically a lot of people with celiac disease have. It is basically like when your digestive system slows down a lot, your bacteria from your large intestine come up into your small intestine where they're not supposed to be, and they overgrow. So that gives you all sorts of symptoms. So now I mostly grain-free, because grains and starches really bother that. If I cut out sugar, like when I do sugar-free, I'm good. Like I said, like I know I'm going on a cruise this next week. I know I'm going to eat sugar. Like there's no way I'm going on a cruise and not eating sugar. So I know I'm going to have like a couple days of repercussion from that. And I try not to eat too much sugar, and I always eat something good before I eat the sugar. But even like if I'm buying my own food, the other challenge is finding supermarkets, right? That you can find gluten-free food, especially if you're in rural areas. Metropolitan areas, pretty easy. But once you get outside the metropolitan areas, sometimes it can be touch and go on what you can and can't find. But thank God for the internet, because if I was celiac without the internet, I have no idea. It would be very, very hard to travel, because now I can look up ahead of time, like see what's in the area. And then the other thing is like you still have to label read everything unless it's a product you bought several times and you know it's safe. So just because it says gluten-free on the front, unless it says certified gluten-free, that means it's been tested. But if it just says gluten-free, you can't trust that it's gluten-free, and you have to flip it over and read it, because sometimes it'll say gluten-free, and while the ingredients in it are gluten-free, it may be processed in a facility that manufactures wheat, barley, or something else that has gluten. So I can't eat that.
That should seem more work. That's just insane. Now, of course,
it is exhausting sometimes. I will say it is sometimes exhausting.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, I don't even know if you drank because we didn't hang out after hours at Podfest, but I mean, beer.
Yes.
I mean, wheat, it is in beer. So do you drink, and how do you get around that?
Beer, the thing about beer is I never liked beer before I had celiac disease. And then I had celiac disease. I'm like, I probably really like beer now. Because you can't have it, so you got to like it.
Right.
Beer, there's two different kinds of quote-unquote gluten-free beer. One is gluten removed, which means they take regular beer and put an enzyme in it, and it breaks it down, but that still has gluten in it. And I cannot drink, anybody who's celiac cannot drink gluten removed beer. If you have gluten intolerance, which means it just bothers you a little bit, but you could probably drink that. And it all depends on the individual. I always tell people, like, do what you're comfortable with. Okay, so I live in a place called McMinnville, Oregon, and right in my town, 10 minutes from my house, there is a dedicated gluten-free brewery. And JP and his partner, they own Beerly Brewing, and it's right downtown, 10 minutes from my house. And they make all of their dedicated gluten-free beer right there on the premises. So they make it with, instead of making it with barley and wheat, they make it with quinoa and millet and some other different grains. And so you can have real gluten-free beer. And I actually like this beer. And I don't know if it's because I'm celiac and I'm not supposed to drink beer and I like it. But there's also hard cider. Like most celiacs can drink almost every hard cider, but I can't do apples now. So that cuts out a lot of hard cider for me. Okay. I kind of really miss that because one of my favorite things to do is to go camping, to get like some Angry Orchard hard cider and drink it by the campfire while I eat my hot dog on my gluten-free bun. So wow. So that's something I can't do anymore, but that's because of the apples. That's not because of my celiac.
Okay. So you did the podcast, you're doing the blog, you have a book, right?
Yes, The Guide to Traveling Gluten-Free.
Has that book turned into like the national guide or directory of, gluten-free restaurants and stuff like that around the country?
So no, not yet. And the book is actually mostly geared towards telling you how to travel. So like how to cruise, how to camp, stuff like that. Because that's the thing that I did not find. So that's what all the stuff I put in my book. But I ended up, this is kind of a funny story. And I don't know if I've told this on a podcast before.
Wow. First all over the place.
We are. What I found out was when I was writing my book, like pre-pandemic, and it's called The Guide to Traveling Gluten-Free. And so I'm like, I will release this in March of 2020. Well, March of 2020 came around. We know what happened. Yeah. So everybody's like, oh, it's going to be gone by the end of the summer. So I'm like, okay, I'll launch it in September. So I launched it in September. And of course, it is still going on. So I have sold my book, but I haven't sold it to the level that I want to. But that's mostly because I really haven't been promoting it because of the pandemic, because it's silly to throw money at something that's travel when you can't travel. So I'm working this summer on doing more promotion with my book.
All right. Well, I will help you promote that.
Thank you.
When you're ready to create that directory, let me know.
Yeah. So I actually do have some of the places I've been. I have in the back of my book, I have restaurants that are safe to eat at the places I've been in, other places like New York City and stuff. But I don't have like that as a big platform thing. I mean, but I have in my book, like when you go to a restaurant, what questions to ask, like how to like tools to find a good gluten-free restaurant, all that stuff. So I like to show people like the whole story in the Bible, because I'm not a big Bible person, but I grew up Catholic. So the old story in the Bible, it's like if you give a man to fish, he can eat for a day. But if you teach him to fish, he can eat for a lifetime. I like to teach people how to fish when they're traveling gluten-free.
Good. All right. Well, Elikqitie, I thank you for giving me all that knowledge and sharing a bunch of your first on podcasts. So it should be interesting.
I hope so. That would be really cool. Yeah. And if you're listening to this, definitely hit me up. And then Marvin, I know you're going to ask me my end of podcast questions I ask everybody else on my show.
Yep, I am.
All right. So my friends, we're going to take a quick break right here. When we come back, Marvin is going to ask me more questions about traveling gluten-free. Hey, gluten-free friends, it's Elikqitie. We know that traveling gluten-free can be hard, but you know what? It doesn't have to be impossible. You can still travel and be independent, have fun, and be in control of your life. Travel the way you want to, even with celiac disease. I know because I travel extensively several months out of the year with celiac disease. If you want to get started on learning more about how to travel gluten-free, grab my free ebook, 10 Tips for Traveling Gluten-Free. In my ebook, you're going to find the basics of traveling gluten-free, from the questions you need to ask when dining out to air travel and cruise travel advice. You're going to find my top tips that I've learned from my expertise. Get your free ebook today by visiting my newly revamped website, www.travelglutenfreepodcast.com. Go to the bottom of the welcome page where you're going to see the beautiful Caribbean boat picture. Click there and sign up today. Receive your free ebook, which is going to be dropped directly into your inbox. Remember, go to www.travelglutenfreepodcast.com. Go to the bottom of the welcome page and get your free ebook and find out my top tips for traveling safely when you're gluten-free. Okay, so we're back for the second half, and I'm super excited to have my guest who's actually interviewing me today. We're doing a little bit of a hot seat thing. His name is Marvin, and he's coming out with a podcast that we're going to talk about at the end of this episode. So Marvin, go ahead and fire away some more travel gluten-free questions that you have.
All right, so let's start with this. What is a city, region, or place that you would highly recommend to a gluten-free traveler?
I'm so excited about this because when I moved to Oregon, I had no idea how amazing Portland was for gluten-free food. My husband and I were in an airport and he's like, what do you think about Oregon? I'm like, I love it. Why? He's like, you want to move there? I'm like, yeah, let's do it.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm a little bit of a risk taker. I'm like, you know what? We move there. We don't like it. We move somewhere else. Not a big deal. But I'm so glad because a couple of things about Oregon that I absolutely love. One is the medical care here is half the price of the medical care in Utah. It's insane. It's way less expensive. And I feel like there's better doctors here.
Really?
So apparently my daughter's boyfriend was telling me people actually move to Oregon for the health care because it's better here and it's less expensive. The other thing I love about Oregon is it is such an amazing food scene. I knew Portland was a first food scene. I had no idea how much of a food scene it was until I moved here. And there are 15 or 16 dedicated gluten-free restaurants in Portland alone, not just in McMinnville. In McMinnville where I live, there's 2 or 3 of them. But in Portland, there's another 15, and then there's even more in Salem. So Oregon is a great place for gluten-free, which I would highly suggest anybody who's listening, come to Portland, come to McMinnville. It's such a great place if you're gluten-free. Another place I would definitely highly recommend is where I went for my birthday a couple weeks ago, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Ellen from the celiac scene started the gluten-free movement there. And there are so many places you can get gluten-free fried food, which is a special treat because that's really hard to find, and just amazing foods. I just actually posted a video on my Instagram of my birthday weekend and some of the food that I ate. So Victoria, BC is another great one. Scottsdale, Arizona has this really great restaurant called Picasso's that I love that I've talked about on a previous episode. New York is really great for gluten-free. There's a place there called Modern Bread and Bagel. I have not been to yet. I'm going this October because everybody raves about the bagels there. And I'm going to bring a separate bag, buy 100 bagels and bring them home in my bag. And I'm going to check that bag and they better not lose it because if they lose it, there's going to be a whole bunch of not nice stuff going on. Wow. Another great place for gluten-free actually is Orlando. I've been to Orlando recently and they're definitely doing a better job on gluten-free. So I was really, really, really very happy about that. And then almost anywhere on the west coast of California does good gluten-free. And Austin, Texas. Love that.
There's one in the middle. I was going to say, do you find that the West Coast does a better job of gluten-free restaurants than the East Coast?
Oh, that's a good question because Philadelphia is another good one for gluten-free. I don't know if they do a better job, but I feel like in California, they do more vegan and vegetarian stuff than they do in Philadelphia and New York. Okay. I might be wrong. I don't have any data to back that up.
I'll be in Pittsburgh in a few weeks, and I know it's a ways away from Philadelphia, but I have people in Philadelphia, so I'll ask. Since the term gluten hasn't come up, I probably won't get a great answer.
So there is one place, if you want to get, there's only 2 places I know that do gluten-free fried chicken in restaurants. One is Max's Wine Dive in Austin, Texas, and the other one is Lovebirds, and it's in Pennsylvania. I don't know how close it is to Pittsburgh, but it's called Lovebirds, and I heard that they do, I think they're dedicated gluten-free, but they do insane gluten-free fried chicken, which is what I heard from several people.
Okay. Let's move on to another question. I'm going to skip around here. But
okay.
I'm going to go back to something that we talked about in the beginning. What is the food you missed most and why?
Right now, it is croissants. And it has been croissants for 3 months. And I just found out today that there's somebody who has a really good croissant that she's making. So I'm super excited about that. And I do believe that Modern Bread and Bagel has croissants because I went on their website to order stuff, but it literally costs the $50 order costs $75 to ship. And so I can't make myself to do that. But croissants are definitely the thing that I miss because I love a good flaky, buttery French croissant. It's so good. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, opposite of that is what is the best gluten-free food that you've eaten?
Oh, gosh. Good question. So I think I eat so much good gluten-free food, and that's really hard to tell. So, okay, I would tell you one of the places I was recently completely just blanking the name of it in Portland.
Do you find it harder to answer these questions than it is to ask them?
Yes, it is definitely harder to answer the questions. Okay, my profile. Okay, if I go on my Find Me Gluten-Free app, I will see. Okay, so this was Harlow on 505 Northwest 23rd Avenue in Portland. They are not only dedicated gluten-free, but they're vegetarian. And so I had the most amazing dairy-free, gluten-free mac and cheese. And it was off the charts. It was so good. Another place I really had really good gluten-free, it's called Be Love. And they're also vegetarian and gluten-free. And that was in Victoria, Canada. And that's where I was for my birthday. So those are 2 places that I have recently had amazing gluten-free food.
So bonus question here.
Yes.
How different is it to eat gluten-free versus vegetarian?
Okay. So people that are vegetarian, they are vegetarian because, and I used to be vegetarian in college. You're vegetarian because it's a lifestyle choice, and you prefer to be vegetarian because of like the eco-friendliness of it and all that. And that's awesome. Like I love people who are vegetarian, like hats off, because I did vegetarian for a while, but I couldn't sustain it. But when you are gluten-free for medical reasons, like if somebody's vegetarian accidentally eats a piece of meat, they're most likely not going to be sick for several days. So that's the main difference, is that with vegetarian or veganism, it's a lifestyle choice. But with celiac disease, it's a lifestyle, but it's not a lifestyle choice.
And I saved this question for last because I know you're so excited. What is your next trip you are taking or thinking about taking in the next calendar year?
Okay, so I'm so glad you asked me this question, Marvin. Even though it was my question I gave you. There's actually a couple trips I have back to back coming up this week. I am going out with my best friend, Sylvia. So shout out to Sylvia. And we're going to be going 8 days on, and by the time this airs, it's already going to be past, but we're going on an 8-day cruise on Royal Caribbean to the Caribbean. And I'm super excited about that because we travel together every year, but we haven't been able to travel in the past couple of years. So I'm super excited to go on that because it's going to be me and her. It's beach, it's hot, sand, sun, and fun. Because when I moved to Oregon, there's many things I love about Oregon, but the two things I don't like about Oregon is, one, I've had constant allergies since I've been here in December, like constant, like it is allergy haven here. And the other thing is it's constantly cold, wet, and rainy in the winter and the spring. And then like literally 2 weeks ago, the sun finally came out.
Oh. Wow.
So I remember one day it like literally rained and stopped 8 times. I'm like, seriously, decide on one. So I'm super excited for this trip because we get to just get suntan, have fun, drink coconut rum, eat lots of food together, have fun, all that good stuff. Super excited about that. And then right at the end of that trip, I'm going to go to Oshkosh Plane Festival because my husband is a small plane pilot. We're going there for a few days. So I'm leaving, like when I get back to the Port Canaveral, I'm going to be getting a lift to Orlando and flying directly to Chicago. So I'm actually packing 2 separate bags.
Oh, my. Port Canaveral, just so you know, close to where I grew up. I'm in Fort Lauderdale.
Oh,
Satellite Beach is where I grew up. So you are coming to cruise capital of the world.
yes. And Fort Lauderdale is the West Coast, correct?
No.
Where am I?
East Coast.
East.
Same coast as Port Canaveral. Just
Wait, how far are you from Port Canaveral?
we are about 3 hours south.
Okay, I was flipping it on the other side because I lived in Florida for 15 years and then I haven't lived there for 9, and I'm always all of a sudden forgetting
And
which
you
is on
forgot
which
all
coast.
about Florida. You don't know where stuff is.
I know where I used to live and I know where Orlando is.
Okay. And where did you used to live? What city?
So I lived in DeLand, which is this great little college artsy town
Yes, it
that is 25 minutes southwest of New Smyrna Beach and 45 minutes northeast of Disney World.
That is true. So DeLand, and there's a couple of other nice places up there. I've got Maitland is where I've got a client. So a little further north and west is where you would be.
Yes, and Winter Park's in that area.
Hudson University is near there.
Yes. Oh, and if you're looking for a good place and you're not gluten-free to eat and you like German food, there's this place in Sanford. It's called the tree something. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway.
Sanford.
Yes. So look up German restaurant in Sanford, Florida, and you'll find it. It's like, it has tree in it and I can't think of the name of it.
Great. How do you think you did on your reverse podcast?
I love this. I love being interviewed on my own podcast. This was so much fun.
Kind of a different angle and different perspective, right?
So we should do this every season. We should do this once a season where you come on and interview me on my podcast.
Well, I have no problem doing that because I am going to have you on my podcast. And
yes, I'm excited to be on your podcast.
I hope you are, and I hope it does well. So, but my podcast, Live Healthy, Be Happy, it'll be all my questions to people, friends, sometimes experts on how to live a healthy life. And it doesn't always have to be about eating. We've got mental health. We've got disease. We've got some cancer in our family we're dealing with now. So all of these things are going to be what I talk about on the podcast. Live healthy, be happy. livehealthypodcast.com is where everything will be.
Good one. Good pick. I love it. All right. Well, Marvin, thank you so much for coming on my show and interviewing me today. This was really fun.
Well, thank you for having me. And I definitely will look forward to the next time we can chat.
Travel Gluten-free Podcast is a production of Travel Gluten-free LLC. Looking for a great way to connect with over 2,000 consumers per month? Contact Elikqitie for information on sponsorship levels to boost your business. Subscribe today so you won't miss a single episode of Travel Gluten-free. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.